just want to say that I mean for this to be pretty informal. If you have any questions or ideas to share with the group, feel free to type a question mark in the text box, and then I can address them as we go. Jody will turn on your microphone after you type the question mark, so you'll actually be able to talk to me then. You don't have to type your whole question in the text box, but you can if you'd rather. It's really up to you. Okay. To start, here's an overview of the types of games, activities, and projects that I plan to talk about in this webinar. That's me with one of my great passions in life, cupcakes. I always like to have a face to put with a name, so there you go. Now you know who you're talking to. First, I'll talk about some of the different reading activities I have my students do as we read the stories in the textbook. But these activities could be adapted to any stories that you're reading with your students. Then I'll go over the vocabulary and grammar games that I use regularly with both the first and second year students. I am a laptop teacher, so I'm often doing a high-tech version of the activity to maximize what I've got going on in terms of that. But all of these could easily be done in a low-tech setting with some modifications, and I'll try to be clear about that as we're going along. And feel free to ask if I'm not doing well enough with that. And finally, I'll give you a sampling of some of the projects that I've used with success with Latin for the New Millennium. Nearly all of these do require computers for research and or presentation, but I feel like most teachers at this point at least have some access to a lab or a library for these type of projects. But if not, speak up about creative solutions that you have for your classroom. And then I promise I will start soon, but I do just want to give you one more piece of background info. Here are my school statistics so that you can have this in the back of your mind as we proceed. If you teach older or younger kids than I do or in a different setting, obviously you may need to adapt to shift to your particulars. Webb is a 6 through 12 boarding and day school. Now up until this year we've had 45-minute class periods, and I saw my students 9 days out of 10, and then every other Wednesday was a planning day for the foreign language department. And during their foreign language class, students would then have either a study hall or a free period depending on their grades and behavior report. But this year we've gone to a modified block with 3 standard length classes and 1 block class per week. And I've generally found that that hasn't affected my teaching anywhere near as much as I thought it would. Basically, it just makes these games and activities even more important because they break up, you know, the notes and the lecture and the culture presentations. But if there's interest, we can talk more about teaching on the block at the end of the session. Anyway, my Latin 1 class has about usually 12 to 16, mostly 8th, 9th, and 10th graders. I occasionally get a junior or a senior in the mix. And with my schedule, I can comfortably get through chapter 15 of the first year book and still have time to do a small project at the end of each unit. This means that we do finish the second year book in the third year and the third year, or in the the first year book in the second year and the second year book in the third year. But I think that doing things outside the book is more important than rushing to be done. The projects add interest and allow me and my students to explore history and culture more fully and go beyond what's being covered in the text. Maybe this is what Dawn meant about my third year curriculum. Right now I'm eagerly awaiting the arrival of Latin for the New Millennium 3, which I'm told is coming out next fall. But in the meantime, in Level 3, we do finish the second year book, and then we do another Bolchazy-Carducci book called Reading Livy's Rome to continue with the history that the students have established in the previous 2 books. Okay, so here we go. Activities. Okay, if there aren't any questions at this time, we can start with the actual presentation. I think there would be, but anyway, okay, so let's get started. Sorry it took me so long to get going. I just think the background is really important. So reading activities. I don't do a reading activity for every chapter. Sometimes we do the very traditional, I read a sentence aloud, and then the student repeats the Latin, and then the student translates the Latin. And when we do this, to add some fun, I have a stuffed hippo that the students can toss around the room to decide who gets to read next. A word of advice, though, if you're going to allow students to throw anything around the room, make sure that it is very light. I used to have a Beanie Baby, but the beans in the little animals that make them Beanie Babies also allowed the students to pelt each other with quite a bit of force, so I took it home for fear of lawsuits. The hippo that I have is very light and can't be used as a weapon. And in reading in this way, you know, it does work well a lot of the time. But even with the diversion of a stuffed animal, it doesn't often hold the attention of all of the class, and it isn't often sensitive to visual learners. The translation is all oral, and I don't want them writing every word of it down. It's too distracting, and it isn't really in line with what our academic sport experts tell us about the brain and learning. Also, if I have to be gone for some reason and have a substitute, a reading activity can provide the framework to keep the class engaged with the story. It's harder for them to completely lose the thread of the story with an activity to keep things going. So that's why I think reading activities are important. And here are some of my ideas with them. The first one is translation editing. Translation editing is a good activity when you need to get through a story faster or have already read the story and want students to review the translation at home. And I've done this two different ways. One way is to prepare the terrible translation yourself and hand it out to the students to correct. So you can see here a terrible translation that I wrote for the Chapter 11 story from the first year book, which is about Dido and Aeneas. And you can see it gets very silly. That story is on page 178 of the first year book if you have it in front of you. I didn't include the original text copied from the book because there's not much room on the slide, and I felt like it was already pretty small. Plus, it doesn't really matter. You can get the idea either way. But anyway, I hope these things are legible. The print is kind of tiny there. The second option is to have students write the terrible translations themselves and then trade them and correct each other's work. And then, of course, you can turn this into more of a game as well. So if you're doing option one, where you've written the terrible translation and they have to correct it, the students must work together or alone to identify errors in translation in the story. And the student or pair or small group of students who identify the most mistakes in a given period of time is the winner. Where for option two, instead of having the students just write the translations with any error at all, you can have the students write tricky, terrible translations of the sentences in small groups. The translation should still contain errors, but sneakier errors if possible. And then the teacher or another class leader, if you choose, can present the tricky, terrible translations to the other groups. And the groups who can correctly identify the errors in translations score points. And if no one can identify any errors, the team who wrote the tricky, terrible translation gets the points instead. The nice thing about the fact that students are intentionally making errors in this activity is that it allows for some face saving and makes an error not so much a source of an embarrassment. I always obviously tell my students it's okay to make a mistake, this is how we learn, etc., etc. But some of my more proud students, especially the boys, do not like to screw up in front of the other students. So this gives them an out. You know, they can claim, oh, that was an unintentional mistake, I did that to trip you up, whatever. Okay, and I'd like to note here that the terrible translation of Chapter 11 that you see on the screen here, as well as any other files that I talk about during this presentation, are in a special folder on the Teachers Lounge website, so you can grab them off the web easily. At the end of the presentation, I'll go to the Teachers Lounge just to show you where those are. If you're not using the Teachers Lounge regularly, you should be. It is really great. Lots of helpful information. Okay, moving on then. Storybooks are another great way to incorporate a mini group project into the chapter. Now this is pretty self-explanatory. Students create an illustrated version of the story, In terms of structure, here again, it is pretty flexible. I've at times given them how I want the text divided up per page, and at times left that up to them and had a required number of pages. I've had them turn in a written translation along with their storybooks. I've had them use the Latin exactly as it appears on the page or summarize it. It really depends on how long you want to spend on the project. The more structure you provide and the less editing of the original story they're allowed to do, the faster it will go. So in terms of the final product, there are, again, high-tech and low-tech options. The best high-tech option that I've found is the Tar Heel Reader website. Students can use pre-existing photos from Flickr or upload their own photos and pair them with text to create a storybook. The picture there is from a Latin 3 class that I did this with years ago. Now that's 2 years ago. The story is the Gallic invasion, so you can see here the Romans in white, and they're totally unprepared as the Gauls in blue attack them. So even just using props in the room and being pretty quick about it, taking the pictures for this definitely took quite a while, so you do sort of have to be prepared for that, and maybe ask the students to do it outside of class if you don't want to spend, at least 3 or 4 minutes setting up every picture. However, I definitely say the kids loved it, and they still talk about that to this day. But of course, if you don't want to spend the time on that, you can also just use markers and crayons and paper. I do storybooks in groups with just crayons and paper at least once a year in each class. And in the folder that I'm going to show you in the Teacher's Lounge again, I put the assignment sheet that I made this year for Paramus and Thisbe, which is chapter 14 on page 234. So you can have a grab-and-go model for this project with an idea of how I've graded it, and then just modify it however you'd like for whatever chapter you're interested in doing it for. A variation on the storybook idea is to have students design comic strips to summarize a story they've read in class. This is good because it forces the students to compose some Latin, but in a very low-stress environment. They don't necessarily have to have as much writing for a comic strip. It's just a few words per panel. The high-tech version of this is so much fun. You can use the makebelievecomics.com website to get this done. The one thing that's annoying about it is you can't save a project and come back to it. So, since you have to create your actual product all at once, I always encourage my students to draw out what they plan to do on their paper and then finish it on the computer. Now, of course, you can just turn the students loose with their pencils, though. The artists in the class really appreciate the chance to shine, and stick figures don't look too terrible in a comic strip if you're like me and can't draw to save your life. So, comic strips and storybooks. Fill in the blank is another good way to review a story you've already read, or read a story more quickly than usual, or read a story on a day that you have a substitute teacher. What you see here is a fill-in-the-blank translation of page 188 of the Level 2 book, and that is also in the files in the Teacher's Lounge. This is pretty much super obvious. It's a partial translation, and you fill in the blanks. I really like to give these for a quiz grade for some. If for some reason we're rushing or something, the students have to read a story outside of class and can't really get my help with it. This way they have some framework and they don't lose the thread of the story as quickly. I think back to one particularly terrible translation that I turned in college that I think the passage was supposed to be about a girl, and I made it about a horse race. And so needless to say, that didn't go very well. So having the framework kind of keeps them on track, but it still forces them to read the story carefully for both comprehension and grammatical understanding without totally, having to make it up on their own. Oh, whoops. Okay. My last story activity, Find It, is really more of a game for reviewing several stories at the end of the unit. You could do it for only one story, but that would obviously cut down greatly on the challenge. So first you divide the class into teams of any size. It doesn't really matter, 2 students, 5 students, whatever. And then hand out on a sheet of paper the translations pulled from recent stories in no particular order. So the students have to find the sentences that the translations represent and copy them out. And the first team with a perfect paper wins. An alternate rule to involve more up and down, if you have a class where it's good for the kids to be moving around a bit more, is to use the same game board, but the sentences should be numbered, and the rules are the same, except even with a large class, the students should only be divided into 2 or 3 teams, and a runner is designated for each team. Once you have that set up, each sentence may only be found once. So once a student finds a sentence and copies it out, he or she hands his or her paper to the runner, who brings it to you or a judge that you assign, standing at the front of the room. Only the runner can leave the group. This is very important. You can't have everyone coming up to the front of the room the whole time. If that sentence is judged correct, then that team scores 1 point, and no other team may find that sentence. So if you have 10 or 15 sentences, there are only 15 possible points. And then the team with the most points wins. So on the slide here, you can see a Find It set from Unit 1 of the second yearbook, which is pages 2 and 3, 18 and 19, and 34. And again, that file is on the Teachers Lounge website. And this Find It activity has only translations in it, but I've done Find It activities where, we've just finished studying participles, so you need to, find 3 present participles, or finding examples of different case uses, or, whatever. They have to locate these different things and show them to you. Okay. So that's all the story activities I plan to share today. Like I said, I do sometimes just do the more traditional reading, but these are kind of nice ways to break it up when you're tired of reading a story in the traditional way. Does anyone else have a reading activity they'd like to share, or a question about any of the ideas that I've shared here? Alrighty then. Without further ado, we'll move on to vocabulary games. Okay. So vocab practice is really a time to have fun and play some good games. I especially like games that get kids out of their seats, moving around the room. Brain research aside, it just breaks up the class and helps keeps us all interested. I put the fly swatter game up here just in case you don't know about it, though I think it's pretty much been around the block a few times. You line up the students at the back of the room in 2 lines with 1 fly swatter per team. I actually don't own any fly swatters, so I just give them a marker to point with. But I've heard of teachers doing this with swords or axes, and obviously definitely real fly swatters make it fun too. So you just write or project all of their vocab words onto the board, and then you call out one of the definitions. One student from each team runs from the back of the room to point at that word, and the first person to point at it gets a point for their team. That is, yeah, okay. So that's a tried and true favorite. Hopefully my other ideas are a little fresher, and you may not have heard of them before. Okay, Crossout is a vocabulary game that I learned from a French teaching colleague. You hand out a 4x4 square with the vocab words in it, as you can see here. By the way, this is another one of the files that I mentioned posting in the Teachers Lounge. Students are in pairs or in groups of 3, and each student has a different color pen. Now, you can let every single person try for each word as you go, in your, both partners or both members of the, or all 3 members of the group of 3. But that generally results in a lot of stabbing with pens that I'm not okay with. So I make them take turns. So what you do is you say, student 1, looking at the board here, your word is my, for example. And then you give all the student 1s about 5 seconds to cross out the word my with their color. And then after 5 seconds you say chance to steal. And if student 1 can't cross out the word, then the student 2 or 3 if there are 3 people in the group can do so. And then you say, what's the word for my? And the students from any group chorus out the answers, and they check to make sure that they've marked off the correct word and not a different word that they'll need to use later. We then go on to the next word with student 2 having the chance to cross out first and the other student or students having the chance to steal. Oh, excuse me. And the student who correctly crosses out the most words wins. This is a good 5-minute game for the beginning of class or the end of class when you just have a little bit of extra time. Okay, this is probably the worst of the images, and I apologize for that. I had trouble figuring out how to take a picture of this idea. So for vocabulary puzzles, using a blank grid, you write on each facing edge of the grid a Latin word on one side and its meaning on the other side. And then you cut the grid into pieces along the lines, separating each Latin word from its English meaning. And then the students must work in teams to put the puzzle back together. The one thing that stinks about this idea is prep time. If you're going to have a puzzle, one puzzle for every 2 or 3 students in the class, which is really preferable, it does take a bit of time in front of the TV to cut them all out. And I've tried using the paper cutter, but it usually just ends up slicing into the pieces. I do save them from year to year, and the friend that I learned this from makes hers on different colored cardstock, which is a great idea to make them more durable and easy to sort out. So I guess you could use this as a Latin club thing if you have kids around who could help you, or a punishment for tardiness or something like that. I mean, you really don't want to waste class time having them cut them out because it does take a little while. Anyway, so this particular puzzle, which reviews mostly words from Level 2, Chapter 5, there are a few words from Chapter 4 thrown in because the grid was too big for the number of words, is in the folder in the Teacher's Lounge. But my handwriting is atrocious, so you may just want to start from scratch with Microsoft Word grid that you print out and write on. I don't know how to type in different directions, so I just write, and thus far the kids haven't complained. The other thing you have to be careful about is making sure that the tails of your P's and Q's don't go over the line. Otherwise the word becomes harder to find and recognize. Okay. For spelling bee, you need 1 to 2 sets of cards, each with 1 letter of the alphabet on them. You want each kid in the class to have 1 to 3 letters. So if you have a big class, 2 sets should be fine. That, by the way, is a picture that I found online. I don't even know who that kid is. But if you have a small class, you can play this game with the whole class a few days in a row and have the kids race against themselves instead of competing with each other. So if you have a larger class, you divide the class in half and give each side of the room a full alphabet with, like I said, each kid having 1 to 3 cards. So, maybe if you have E, you don't need any other letters, but if you have Q, Z, and P, you probably need all of those in order for it to be interesting or something like that. And then taking turns from one team to the other, you give the vocab word, and one team must race to spell that word by having the students with the proper letter cards on his or her desk call them out in order and raise them up. Or stand up if you have a high energy group and you want to keep them moving. I generally just ask for the nominative of a noun, the infinitive of a verb, the masculine form of the adjective, etc. But you could ask them to spell as many forms as you want. With 2 teams, I think I would go 3 words per team at a time, just so they don't say, they got all the short words, they got all the long words, because everything is always unfair with teenagers. And then the team with the faster time wins that round, and then maybe you play 3 rounds. With one team, we usually go through about 10 words, and then either the next day or later in that class period, they try to beat their time. And this really forces everyone to pay attention because everyone on your team gets annoyed if you miss your letter. It's not just, you're not just playing for yourself. Okay. Adapting Pictionary to play in class is another great way to review vocabulary. And with some slight modifications, everyone can be busy the whole time instead of only part of the time. I really try to make sure my games keep as much of the class active as possible at all times. I don't like it where it's just one person answering me and everyone else is just sitting there not paying attention. So how I adapt Pictionary to play in class is that I give each student a vocab word and have him or her draw a picture of it. And then, they only have a minute or so. And then you tape all the pictures up on the board. And then each student must then guess what each illustration is of. So they all go up to the board and they guess the illustrations. And then, of course, you just go through them all, and the person who gets the most right gets a sticker or a point on the chart or whatever. And hold on one second, Patricia. And then a variation of this is to give groups of students a sentence to illustrate. So what you do is you have, some silly sentences, and you have, 2 or 3 kids think about the sentence and then come up with a way to illustrate it. And then you pass the illustration without the sentence to another team, and then have them try to write a sentence that's a caption for the picture. And then you see, how closely the 2 sentences match each other. And that one we've had some real fun with, especially if you write really silly or odd sentences for them to illustrate, such as, "Don't love injustice," or "The sparrow hates the peace of the old man." You can come up with these really funny things, and then, they, of course that's a road. How did you not know it was a road? That kind of thing. Okay, so Patricia, I think Jody's answered your question. Absolutely, you can have access to my slideshow. I'll give you my email address at the end as well if you have any questions. And yes, so you will have access to it if you don't feel like taking notes. That is totally fine. Okay. That's Pictionary in its 2 forms. Okay. I wanted to offer a couple of particularly techie tools for vocabulary too, just in case any of your schools are pushing you to use more technology the way that my school is encouraging me to do. So here are 2 of my favorites. I use Quizlet.com as a practice vocabulary site. You can search for me. I'm Magistra Bella. My English name is Kelly, which means warrior in Irish. So my Latin name is Bellatrix because that means warrior woman in Latin. So Magistra Bella is just short for Magistra Bellatrix. And another Latin for the New Millennium teacher named Sherry Jankowski, whose screen name is actually just Latin teacher, also has lists. So you can search for either of us or Latin for the New Millennium and find lots of pre-made vocab lists so you don't have to make your own. But on Quizlet, students have the ability to just look at the flashcards. You can see right now both sides is checked, but if you uncheck that, you can see the Latin first or the English first and then flip to the other side. Or you can make tests for practice or play games with the words. Scatter is a matching game. Space Race is a game where they have to type the words and spell them correctly. Scatter is definitely the favorite with my kids. They like to do it and time themselves and compete with each other. The site does have the capability for you to track how and when your students study on Quizlet, and in fact, as you can see here, you can share with them on Facebook or on Twitter your flashcards or email them. So, if you link with your students via any of those things, you can join up with them through Quizlet as well. I also use the Discovery Channel's website to make word games to print out for the kids. It's a really easy website and it's free. You can make word searches, crossword puzzles, those ones where certain letters in each answer spell out something at the bottom. So these make really great homework assignments. And in case you need a fun joke for your letter spelling puzzle, my favorite one is this. How do you split the Roman Empire? With a pair of Caesars. Ha 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 ha. I'm sure you're all laughing, and it's just that your mics are turned off that I can't hear you. Anyway, that one usually gets a hoot from the students. They think it's silly. Okay, I could probably go on for a while with vocabulary games, but I want to move on at this point to some kind of maybe more grammar-oriented games. But does anyone have any other questions or comments at this point? Thank you, Lauren. That's helpful. Any questions or comments about vocab games that you really like? Okay, well, we'll move on to grammar games then. Okay. So these are games that I mostly use with grammar topics. I'm sure that you can, modify any of these things to be vice versa. I use these to practice vocabulary, use others to practice grammar, but this is just the way I usually do it for whatever reason. The first is a twist on board races. I like it because instead of only having the quickest student involved, it keeps all the students involved. So ahead of time, you take 10 popsicle sticks on which 6 are written point values, unum, duo, tria, punctum, puncta, etc. And on the other 4 of which are written servate puncta, keep your points, rapite puncta, steal the points, mutate puncta, trade points, and sacrificate puncta, lose all your points. So in class, you divide the students into as many teams as you can fit at your board, or you give each team a small whiteboard. We've been doing this with small whiteboards lately, and it's been going really well. And then ask whatever question you would normally ask. Conjugate this verb, translate this short sentence, form this participle, anything, whatever you normally do, noun, adjective pairs, whatever. One person from each team answers the question. And then all students who get the correct answer score 2 points for their team regardless of speed. So, everyone has the opportunity to answer, and then whoever answers it correctly gets their 2 points. I encourage helping, which maybe other people would call cheating, to keep the whole team involved so the other 2 kids aren't sitting there, just waiting. But that's me, if you're more serious about games and rules, maybe you wouldn't want to do that. And even if we're doing small whiteboards, I do make them pass the whiteboard from one person to another, because otherwise you just get that one person on the team who answers every question and nobody else reviews. And, obviously you just have to shut that down. But anyway, then the person who gets the correct answer fastest must choose a stick from the bundle. No choice. Point sticks add points to your team. The servate stick may be kept and used later as a protection in case later someone tries to steal or trade scores, or you draw the sacrifice stick. You can turn in the keep your point stick to protect yourself. The rapite stick means that you get to choose another team and steal their points and add them to yours. The mutate stick means that you must trade scores with another team even if you have the most points. And the sacrificate stick means that you lose all your team's points. This twist really keeps the slower kids in the class from just giving up. They can still earn 2 points for their team. And also, because there is the element of surprise with the sticks, the score isn't a foregone conclusion, and it isn't over until it's over. Frequently I'll play this game with a class, and in the last round the team with the most points draws the sacrifice stick and loses it all. Or a team who hasn't been playing very well all along, draws the trade stick and steals all of another team's points. So it can get really exciting, and it keeps them interested in getting the answer and getting it quickly, but in knowing that even if they don't get it first, or they aren't going to be first because oh, this kid is up against me, I'll never get it, they can still score those 2 points for their team, and that person who goes faster than them might lose something for their team anyway. So, like I said, the element of surprise kind of keeps it more interesting. Okay. Avalanche is another great game because it's very active and has the kids on their feet, and also a team close to winning can lose it all right at the end. So what you do for this is you line your students up at the big board in teams of 3 to 6. I'm not sure how this would work with a larger class. Can you fit 6 rows of 5 students at a standard chalkboard? I would assume so. But if not, you could, I guess, use the little small whiteboards. You just have to be really vigilant about tracking what they're doing. But anyway, you give the students a task that requires multiple steps, such as conjugate a verb, decline a noun or a noun-adjective pair, write 5 vocab words that are nouns, give the 4 parts of this verb, etc. And then each student writes 1 word or 1 part of the answer and then goes to the back of his or her team's line. And you monitor their progress as they're doing this. And if a mistake is made as they're writing, they finish an answer, this causes an avalanche. The entire answer from the top, not just that answer, is erased, and the team must start over with the next person. The first team to complete a given number of tasks, such as declining 3 nouns, conjugating 4 verbs, etc., wins. Excuse me. I have a case of the Tuesdays. So anyway, that's Avalanche. Okay. Jason, if you can find something for other students to do, you can have a tournament style. Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, okay, I see what Jason is suggesting. If you have a larger class of students, you could be playing the game with half the class while the other half of the class is doing a reading activity or a worksheet or something like that, and then switch off. That would work well. Thank you, Jason, for that suggestion. At a private school, if you have a class with more than 14 students in it, everyone is like, 14 students, how do you manage? And I'm thinking, really? When I taught public school classes, I had 30 and it wasn't a problem. But I guess your perspective just changes a little bit in these smaller schools. Anyway, thank you, Jason. Okay, so Guess Who is a game that I learned from Matthew Webb. He's a Latin teacher who's very active in advocating and developing active Latin teaching strategies. He's not in any way connected with the Webb School, and in fact, we've only met once at ACL, like, I don't even know, 8 years ago, and I don't think he would remember me. But anyway, his website, www.magisterweb.com, it's just W-E-B-B, is a wellspring of information. He's got lots of awesome PowerPoints and game ideas, so I highly recommend checking out his website. To play Guess Who, you need to prepare in advance a grid of verb forms, noun forms, vocab words, whatever you want to fill it with. You can see that this grid has been filled with subjunctive verbs, so it's practice to be used during Chapter 3 of the Level 2 book, and again, it's in the folder online. So anyway, you give 1 grid to every student and instruct him or her to choose the word, choose 1 word on the grid, and then you partner off the students, and the student's partner will try to guess his word by asking yes/no questions to rule out incorrect answers. So example questions for this could be, is your verb singular? Is your verb present tense? Is your verb made from the word scribere? So from these answers, yes or no, the asker crosses out the words that can't be right. So for example, if you asked, is your verb singular? And the person said yes, then you would cross out all the plural verbs. So again, the nice thing about this game is that everyone asks and everyone answers. There's no one sitting around waiting. And Magister Webb even has the students asking and answering these questions in Latin. So if you consult his grids online, you can see he has the proper questions at the bottom. So obviously, the object of the game is to guess your partner's word before he or she guesses yours. The only thing that you sort of have to make sure of is that your weaker students know the answers to all their questions. I've had some frustrated students who, so you ask your partner, is your verb plural? And they say, oh, yeah, it is. And then, they actually had a singular verb and they just didn't know it. So you kind of have to watch for that. But otherwise, it's really fun, and they have a good time with it. Another good super quick game is Quis Sicarius, and this is a great one to play early on when students are just getting used to listening to verbs. So they're listening to hear this, who the subject of the verb is, and then crossing it off accordingly. It's also good when you just have a few minutes to do some quick verb practice with any level of students. So you start by asking the students to write the 6 subjects on a whiteboard or a scrap piece of paper. And then you read 5 sentences which give an alibi for 5 of the 6 subjects and instruct the students to cross off the subjects from each sentence as they hear them. So for example, you'd say, in agris ambulo, and then the students would cross off ego. And then you would say, canam paratis, and then they would cross off vos, and so on for 3 more sentences. And then you ask them, after 5 sentences, Quis est Sicarius? And then the subject that you did not read a sentence about is the murderer. So in this sentence, is ea would be the murderer. Is ea est Sicarius? This game can usually be repeated 4 or 5 times even in 10 minutes without the kids getting too bored. So it's a good quickie when you only have a few minutes left in class. You can say, oh, get out a scrap piece of paper, we're going to play Quis est Sicarius, and you can think of the sentences on the fly. It's also a good one in that it gives the students a lot of input and a lot of practice with listening, and then the only thing that they actually have to produce at the end of it is 1 sentence. Tu es Sicarius or vos est Sicarius. There's not a long product that they have to think of at the end. Okay. Battleship is also a verb game, but it could become a noun game too, I suppose. Battleship is the classic battleship that you remember from your childhood. You have 2 grids, one where you hide your own ships, and the other to guess where your opponent's ships are. So to play, you give a piece of paper with the 2 grids on it to each student, and then you have them hide their ships up here. For a board this size, I usually have them hide one ship that's 4 spaces long, 2 that are 3 spaces long, and 1 that is 2 spaces long. This grid's a little bit smaller, so like I said, you don't do the full number of ships. And then once the ships are hidden, to guess a space, you line up the verb along the side with the subject at the top, and then conjugate the verb for that subject in the tense that you've been practicing for that chapter. This board goes with chapter 17 of the first year book, so you can see I've given them the 3rd principal part because this is when we're practicing the pluperfect tense. So your opponent then finds the form you're looking for. So to guess this spot right here, I would say extinxeros, and you would check your board and say extinxeros is either a hit or a miss. And then obviously you win by sinking all of your opponent's ships, just as you did when you played Battleship when you were a kid. This does take a little bit longer, and for most of the time you will be walking around the classroom saying, conjugate your verbs, conjugate your verbs, conjugate your verbs, because you'll get the lazy students who will just say imperator extinguo, and so on, rather than having the challenge of actually conjugating the verbs correctly, which is obviously the point in the exercise, not actually just finding out who the best Battleship player in the class is. I've never played this as a noun game before, but you could do so by replacing the subjects at the top with the cases, so nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, and the verbs with nouns, and then of course you would have to decline the noun correctly to get to the space instead. Okay, this grid is in the files in the folder, and it's easy to modify for any chapter. You can just change the verbs or the subjects. Okay, one more grammar game idea that I really like is the human sentence. You write down on large note cards several parts of 5 or 6 words or as many groups as you'd like to have, and maybe some prepositions depending on what you're reviewing or practicing. And then you give all the cards for one word to a group of students. And then you say a sentence out loud that can be made of those words. So the groups must then select the version of their word that completes the sentence from the pile you've given them and send it to the front of the room. When the sentence is totally correct, you send the standing students back to their desks and start again with a new word. Now you are sort of limited, obviously, because you can only make sentences out of those 5 or 6 words, but really you'd be amazed at the combinations you can come up with 3 nouns and 2 verbs, especially if you put in and or prepositions. You know, you can really make a lot of different combinations. Or, you know, if you just do pairs of students instead of 3s and 4s, you could have 10 or 12 words to make sentences out of. That would just require, obviously, a lot more prep work. But the words can be used over and over, and then you can just add to them as you have new vocab words. You can, you know, substitute out only one word, but use some of the old words, too, to cut down on your prep work in the human sentence. As a final note on grammar games, I just want to add that any exercise can become a game. I rarely ask my students to just do an exercise in class without introducing some element of cooperation or competition. This just helps keep us all entertained. So to that end, the website there is from JC Schools. I have no idea who the JC Schools are, where they came from. I'm not endorsing them, but anyway, it has PowerPoint versions of a lot of TV shows that can be converted into review games if you have a projector in your room. If not, I have a transparency of the Snakes and Ladders game you see here in my room. So if you get an answer right, you get to roll the die and move the correct number of spaces. And then if you end on a snake, you go down. And if you end on a ladder, you go up. You can turn the answers into multiple choice. And then hand out cards that say A, B, C, D on them and have the students hold up the answer that they think is correct. Or you can actually have them vote using their cell phones to text their answer into the website Poll Everywhere if you and your students are, or if you and your school are comfortable with that. I've never used Poll Everywhere, but from what I understand, as the students text in their votes, a graph pops up on the screen so you can get immediate feedback on how well they did on that question. But anyway, you know, the whole idea is just, it's Mary Poppins in real life. A spoonful of sugar really does help the medicine go down. I've not yet met a single student who enjoys memorizing irregular verb forms, but I know a lot who like to play Guess Who when they were kids, and you know, they probably still enjoy it today. So what they enjoy, they have a better chance of remembering and a better chance of practicing again. You know, they're willing to do the work if it makes them better at a game or more able to beat their peers at something, especially the boys. I've found that this is true for. So just a really good way to keep kids motivated and interested in class. Okay, that's all I really want to say right now about grammar games, because I'd like to use the last part of this hour and a half to talk about projects. But before we move on, does anyone have any thoughts or questions about the ideas that I just shared? All right, then I will move on now to talk about projects. I do a project for every unit of Latin for the new millennium, if not more than that. And when I say project, I mean a writing assignment or a presentation or some kind of artistic endeavor. I think projects are really important for students for all the reasons that I put up there. It allows the students to creatively explore Latin, often while working in a team, in a setting that enables them to use technology and higher order thinking. A project, in my opinion, is much more like adult life than tests. I'm not saying at all that we should give up on tests. I think they're really important too, because it's pretty much the only way to make sure kids are going to study. However, I do think that well-designed projects are great preparation for a lot of adulthood. A lot of what most people do is work in a team to create a product. However, projects have to be well-designed on the part of the teacher or they're a waste of time for most of the students. You know, you would learn from a brick wall kids would do fine with minimal guidance, but most of your class needs to know what you expect in clear language, because otherwise they're going to come up with something, you know, crazy that maybe explores their interests a lot but doesn't necessarily explore you know, the relevant topic or display it in a way that's meaningful. So I always give out the rubric that I'll use to grade the projects with the project handout on the first day. And that way students can't reasonably argue that they weren't told that they needed to do X, Y, or Z because it's all there in black and white. And then after they do their projects, I will give them a copy of the rubric as well and have them grade themselves so that they can kind of see like, oh, well, okay, maybe I put a lot of time into this, but I didn't follow the directions, I didn't do this and that. You know, it helps them sort of understand why they're getting the grade that they are and hopefully be more prepared for their next project. Okay. The first project that I want to talk about is the Facebook project. I use this with gods and goddesses in the first year, usually at the end of the first unit, but you could modify this to be about heroes, famous Romans, Roman authors, really whatever you would like. Students research a person and then make a Facebook for him or her. In the folder I was telling you about, there's a rubric and a Facebook template just like the one you see here, or you can use the website listed there, My Fake Wall. You can see my template is pretty old. I don't think Facebook has looked like that in quite some time, but I like that it focuses more on the info rather than the, you know, news feed the way that the new Facebook does. So I like it better because it kind of forces them to show more about them, you know, whatever character they're researching rather than you know, just a lot of status updates. So I still like my kind of old Facebook better, but you can play around with it and see what you think. My rubric requires a certain amount of information to be given in each section, and then the students present these on our Parents' Day, and you know, the parents think it's great how much their kids know about what they've learned about gods and goddesses. This is one that I designed, and I chose to use the Greek names because I didn't want to steal anyone's thunder, but obviously I make them do the Roman names and stories. Okay. At the end of Unit 3 in the first year, we do a project on the geography of Rome and her major monuments. I use maps from the Roman map workbook that Bolchazy-Carducci sells that's by Elizabeth Heimbach. Each student is then responsible for researching a major monument in Rome and making an online poster of it and presenting it to the class. Then all the students take a quiz where they're expected to label all the monuments and some of the geographical landmarks such as the 7 hills of Rome and the Tiber on a map, and identify some of the monuments from pictures and then match each to some major fact about the site. So for the posters, I use Glogster, which is www.edu.glogster.com, which is an online poster making site. I use this for a couple of reasons. First of all, as soon as they're done with the projects, I'm not then stuck with 30 posters at the end of the day that are in my classroom and don't leave for months and months and months. But also, I think that the kids are able to be a lot more creative and produce a much better product when they don't have to worry about where the glue sticks are at their house, the fact that they can't get to Kinko's to use a color printer, you know, all those things that kids come up with as an excuse. The blog you see here on this slide about the Circus Maximus is actually from a weaker student in my class. And so you can see that it still came out pretty nice. You know, everything is still legible. He's got reasonable pictures that meaningfully show the Circus Maximus. And also using the educational version of Glogster, all of the students can look at their classmates' work after the project is presented, so the glogs then become a study guide for the quiz. Anytime that I have my students doing serious presentations in front of the class, I usually do give a quiz following it because I want the students to pay attention to each other's projects, and I've found that they just really don't care unless their own grade is resting on it as well. So a rubric for this project and a grade sheet, an explanation of the project, and a quiz are all in the folder. So you can check that out and modify it as it suits your needs best. At the end of the 4th unit in the first year book, we have a Roman feast to connect to the culture reading on pages 211 and 12 about Roman food and dining. However, because I teach boarding students, it's hard to ask them to bring food from home, and our class periods haven't really been long enough to cook during the day. So I provide minimal feasting food and then offer the students extra credit for supplementing our stores with a Roman recipe. This usually involves getting together with them in the evenings to cook something. Last year I made a pear patina that was the worst tasting thing I've ever had in my life. I felt really bad for the kids that I made it with. But anyway, their project then, since they can't make the food, is to decorate the dining room. So the students complete a research sheet about ancient art, and then they choose one style to make a representation of. For your least artistic students, the project includes a way to make a mosaic online, and then all they have to do is email me the code that shows that they've learned, what a real Roman mosaic would look like and made an effort to imitate one of the styles. They don't even have to print it out. This past year I got some great mosaics and paintings. No one really tried to sculpt. But anyway, on our feast day, we drape ourselves in togas and show off our art and then eat snacks. It is a little bit of a tough day for you because you're going to feel like a crazy person getting it all ready, but the kids really do love it. The research sheet and the guidelines for this project are in the file, and Jason, that includes the website for the mosaics. I don't know it off the top of my head, but as soon as we finish this, I can definitely find it and show it to you in the teacher's lounge where you can find it, or also you can email me after this and I could locate it in about 2 seconds on a different computer than the one I'm on right now. Of course, that's the law of the universe. So, Jason, hold that thought. Sorry. Okay, so that's the Roman art project. No problem. Okay. In the second year, as you probably noticed, the focus of the textbook shifts from classical Rome to the medieval period and the Renaissance. So last year I worked hard to incorporate projects that reflects this. So after Unit 2, the students made Illuminated Manuscripts. In Unit 2, there are stories from both the Gesta Romanorum and a poem by a Goliard, which is reflective of the Carmina Burana. So after we looked at some illuminated manuscripts in class, they wrote stories or poems inspired by either the Gesta Romanorum or the Goliards, and then illuminated them according to what we had learned about pre-press manuscripts. Now, due to time constraints and my desire to get a higher quality product out of my students, I did have them write in English for this. However, if you have more time to work in several drafts, you could certainly do this as a composition project. And project handouts for this are in the file. Okay. The final project that I'd like to share with you today is one that uses the heroes essays from the second year books as a jumping off point. Students in small teams research a hero and create a pitch for why that hero's life should be made into a movie, complete with a movie poster. And again, we use Glogster to create the movie posters. And after all of the presentations, all of the students were responsible for a few facts about each hero in a brief quiz. Because of the sales aspect of the presentations, I did have to remind pretty much every group to tell us a bit more about the hero that the movie was about. And next time I'll probably include more of that on the rubric to make sure that students know how important it is from the start, because otherwise they mostly just wanted to talk about, why Mel Gibson would make a great Theseus. And you know, while the antics of Mel Gibson's life are, of course, particularly entertaining to high school students, they don't really educate most of us about Theseus. So, you know, you kind of have to get them a little more focused there. But anyway, the project handout and the rubric and the quiz for this lesson, as my students were presenting them last year, obviously you have to change the quiz a little bit depending on what the different groups emphasize about the different heroes, are in the file. So, okay, that's the last project I want to talk about. So I do want to just show you quickly, if I can get my computer to cooperate, where these things are in the Teacher's Lounge. Will you do it? Okay, so they're down at the bottom. If you scroll down past all of this to the forum, and this was a long time ago, so it's, oh, well, I thought it was in the forum. Shoot. Maybe it's in the blog. Sorry, this is horrible. I should have looked for these in advance. No.
Kelly, you should be able to go under your own profile.
Yeah. Oh. This is terrible. I'm sorry. I hate wasting other people's time. I should have done this in advance. Under my page?
Yes.
And
then look in like your blog in that area and see where you've posted things.
Here it is. Okay, so it is under discussions, apparently, but it must have been further down than I was looking. So there's a folder here that has 6 megabytes of stuff in it that you can see, that has all the stuff in it in a zip file, where you can then find all the files and activities that I talked about this year. I also have a Dropbox that has all of my files in it that I've made from Latin 1 and 2, that if you are interested, okay, well, I'm not going to open this right now, but if you're interested, I can email you all of my files. And there's my email address, knorthrup@webbschool.com. So if there's anything you would like, you can definitely get in touch with me. If you're, having trouble with the Teacher's Lounge, or you just can't find anything, or whatever it is that you're looking for, if you can't find something specific, I can definitely email it to you. Or if you'd like to see any of my other projects or ideas, I'm always happy to share, and I'm always hoping that someone will say, and here's my great idea that I have, and then I'll be able to use that. I've been emailing a lot lately, with it being the beginning of the year, and I learned a terrific game from these emails called Bang, where you write all the vocab words on popsicle sticks, and you have them, and then on 3 extra popsicle sticks you write the word bang, and you have the students draw the stick, and if they can tell you what the word on the stick means, they get to keep the stick, but if they draw the bang stick, they lose all their other sticks. And it may even be someone in this forum who taught that to me, and if so, thank you. Yeah. So anyway, I always enjoy communicating with other teachers about this stuff, because I think it's the best way we all learn from each other. And Jody there is also saying she can help people locate, my information. It's jcall@bolchazy.com. You can see in the window there. Okay. Those are all the ideas that I have put into my PowerPoint to share. But at this time, I'm happy if anyone has anything else they'd like to ask about or talk about, or ideas that they'd like to share. I'm happy to open it up to discussion. Anyone have anything they'd like to ask about or talk about?
And I can turn your mic on so you can speak and you won't have to type everything.
Okay, Jason, sure. What do you...
Here, let me turn your mic on, Jason. Go ahead. Kelly, he's
Am I coming through now?
Yes.
Am I coming through now? Okay, all right, cool. So thank you to Jody and to Kelly for this. But for Illuminated Manuscripts, I did that last year as well, and we were able to use the gold markers that you can get at craft stores for fairly cheap. The students really seem to like that. And then the other thing that we're thinking about doing this year is taking the chemistry that was used during the Middle Ages to make those illuminated manuscripts. We're going to go down to the chemistry lab, and we're going to try to get a flame test going with the teacher down there. So what a flame test is they'll take a solution of copper, for instance, and set it on fire, and it will come up as the color that copper would be used to create in that manuscript. So hopefully that'll give the kids a chance to connect that again to chemistry as well, kind of have a global education or interdisciplinary lesson with that too.
That is so cool. What a good idea. I always really like things where I can get other teachers involved in my classroom. My Latin 1 students, we had a student drop the class within the first 2 weeks, and so because it's a student who used to be my advisee and I'm pretty close to him, we had a funeral, and they got really interested in death masks and imagines, so I've been having to do tons of research about imagines and what they are, and I've actually worked it out with an art teacher to come in and like sort of team teach a class. And that's so cool that you found a way to work science and especially chemistry into Latin. I think any time that you can sort of show them the connection between their subjects and make them realize, hey, what you learn in this class doesn't only matter in this class. I will never forget the day when I was explaining to my students that they needed to cite their sources and that they were welcome to use MLA citations to do it. And a kid informed me that that was English class and this was Latin class. You know, oh, well, yeah, it still applies here. Sorry, you do have to cite your sources. It's all the same. You know, anytime you can help them draw those connections between things, especially subjects, you know, crossing the arts and humanities, sciences line always really helps. So that's really cool. I'll have to talk to the chemistry teacher here and see if I can get him interested in team teaching my Latin class for a day. That'd be fun.
Yeah, and going along with the connections to other classes too, I stole an idea from Webb up here in Michigan a while ago, and that's called Latin Moments. And I have the students actively looking in their other classes for times when Latin shows up, or Roman culture, or anything like that. And they have to then bring in 3 examples per marking period to our class, and they share it. We generally take the time after a quiz when everybody's kind of, you know, looking to not do much, and then we share that, use that time for that. And a lot of kids really get into it. Share many, many more than 3 per quarter, so we do that. They really enjoy it.
Yeah, definitely. That's really cool. Anyone else have a topic that you'd like to talk about or something that you'd like to share or ask about? Okay. Well, I'll go back to the slide with my email address on it. If you have anything else that you think of later or you just want to connect with someone, I definitely know what it's like to be the only Latin teacher working with a book for the first time and feeling like you have to write everything and develop everything and you know, make all your own worksheets and activities and stuff, and that can be a really lonely feeling. So you're not alone. Get out there and oh wow, that's so cool. Very awesome, Lauren. I don't think we have, I'm in such a rural area. It would be hard for me to get to Illuminated Manuscripts quickly. Vanderbilt's about an hour away. That's probably our closest source. But that's a really cool thing that you live close enough to be able to do that. Anyway, I'm always willing to help. If I have it, it's yours, and I'm glad to share it with you. So thank you everyone very much for coming, and don't hesitate to be in touch if there's anything else I can do for you.
Thank you, Kelly. If anybody has any other questions accessing the Teacher's Lounge or information, you can email me, and I'll put you in touch with somebody if I can't answer your question. Okay. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks. Have a good night.